Have you ever imagined that the Korean, Chinese, and Japanese populations may have more in common genetically than many people think? While their cultures are distinctly different, there is a shared genetic foundation that traces back to a common past. What does this mean? And how have these similarities and differences helped shape the identities of these peoples over time? These three groups not only share genetic traits, but also have ancestral roots that trace back to a group of Neolithic farmers from the Green Run. This common link goes beyond cultural and historical boundaries, reflecting how biological evolution and migration influenced the formation of these populations' characteristics. However, these similarities do not mean that they are identical. There is complexity that goes beyond genetics. China, for example, is home to an impressive ethnic diversity. With over 50 ethnic groups, the majority of the Chinese population belongs to the Han group, which represents 92% of the total population. This group has played a crucial role in shaping China's national identity, but other ethnicities, with their own traditions and languages, also contribute to the country's rich cultural tapestry. With 1.4 billion inhabitants, China not only leads the world in terms of population, but also stands out as a global economic powerhouse. Japan, on the other hand, follows a distinct trajectory. The majority of the Japanese population is made up of the Yamato, who represent 97.4% of the population, but Japan also houses native peoples such as the Ryukyuans and the Ainu. These groups, though minority, offer a rich contribution to Japanese history and culture, revealing the complexity of a country that remains relatively homogeneous while simultaneously plural. The Korean peninsula, in turn, has its own evolutionary history. Koreans share ancestral roots with the Chinese due to geographical proximity and historical interactions. However, Korea has followed its own path, with a unique identity shaped by its own language, culture, and history, as well as a strong desire for cultural preservation. While it is a smaller country in terms of population, Korea has been an influential cultural power, especially with the global rise of K-pop and Korean cinema. So, what unites or separates these peoples? Genetics reveals a connection, but it is history, culture, and regional conditions that have truly formed each group's unique identity. As we've seen, DNA can connect, but it is the cultural histories that really define them. Curious, right? Genetics shows a link between these peoples. But how has each one developed its own identity? Before we continue, leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss this complete analysis. Now that we understand the strong genetic connection between Koreans, Chinese, and Japanese, an intriguing question arises. Why, despite the genetic similarities, did each of these groups develop such distinct cultural and biological characteristics? How did small differences in genetic composition help shape the populations and influence the diversity we see today? The answer begins with the observation that, although all share a common ancestry from the ancient Neolithic farmers of the Green Run, the different proportions of this DNA among the groups created biological distinctions. The Chinese and Koreans have a closer connection, with 77% of their genetic composition originating from these ancient farmers. This means that, in addition to the genetic similarities, these populations share many biological traits, from physical characteristics to predispositions to certain health conditions. The Japanese, on the other hand, share this same origin but with a significant difference. They have approximately 61% of their DNA derived from the Neolithic farmers of the Green Run, a lower proportion compared to the Chinese and Koreans. But what makes the Japanese different? One explanation lies in Japan's unique and isolated influences, such as the presence of the Jomon people, a native group who inhabited Japan before the arrival of continental migrants. This historical isolation allowed the Japanese to evolve in a unique way, with genetic and cultural characteristics that distinguish them from their neighbors. The Jomon people represent a significant portion of the Japanese genetic heritage. With 18.8% of their DNA coming from this indigenous population, the Japanese maintain exclusive characteristics related to their insular geography and adaptation to the Japanese environment. A comparison with Koreans, who have only 5.2% Jomon DNA, illustrates how evolutionary history and geographical isolation played a key role in shaping the genetic identity of the Japanese. Additionally, another important difference arises from the interaction of the Chinese with populations from the southern Asian states. About 33% of the Chinese DNA comes from farmers from Southeast Asia, such as Indonesians and Cambodians. This connection brings the Chinese closer to the Southeast Asian populations and highlights a significant genetic difference compared to Koreans and Japanese, who have a weaker link to this genetic component. Koreans, by contrast, have a more Korea-centric genetic identity, with less influence from the farmers of Southeast Asia. However, Koreans do not share the same connection to the Jomon or other island populations, as seen with the Japanese. This makes Korean genetics more focused on a continental context, with migrations and interactions more restricted than those that occurred in Japan. These genetic distinctions are not mere curiosities. They explain the unique cultural and biological development of each of these peoples. The Chinese, with deep roots in the continental Asia, have always had greater interaction with other cultures, which shaped their history and traditions. Koreans, with an identity more focused on local cultural preservation, also formed a unique society, while the Japanese, isolated by their archipelago, maintained many distinct cultural elements that define Japanese society to this day. As we have seen, the genetics of Koreans, Chinese, and Japanese have common origins, but over time, interactions with different environments, cultures, and geographical conditions have uniquely shaped each of these populations. But how did geography and the environment further influence these cultural and genetic differences? China, with its vast territorial expanse, has been the stage for multiple interactions between different ethnic groups over the centuries. Its immense geographical diversity, ranging from the western mountains to the coastal plains of the east, contributed to the formation of a variety of cultural traditions and regional identities. Furthermore, cultural and commercial exchanges, such as the famous Silk Road, played a crucial role in the diffusion of ideas and genetic exchange with other regions, including Southeast Asia and even Africa and Europe. On the other hand, Japan, due to its insular condition, was isolated from many external influences until the beginning of the modern era. This geographical condition allowed Japan to preserve many unique cultural and genetic traits. The Jomon people, who inhabited Japan for thousands of years before the arrival of continental migrants, left a deep mark on the physical and cultural characteristics of the Japanese. Additionally, Japan's history is filled with moments of resistance against external influences, such as the Mongol invasions in the 13th century and the Sakoku policy of isolation during the Edo period, which lasted until the 19th century. This natural protection, coupled with Japan's self-sufficiency, enabled the development of a unique culture and a more isolated genetic identity. The Korean peninsula, in turn, with its strategic position between China and Japan, was constantly influenced by both. The Goryeo dynasty, for example, established commercial and diplomatic ties with China, while interactions with Japan led to cultural and even military exchanges. Korea's geography, with its mountains and coasts, also played an important role in shaping Korean society, providing natural defenses against external invasions and encouraging agriculture and community life. These environmental influences, ranging from the fertile plains of China to the isolated archipelagos of Japan, helped define the cultural and biological characteristics of each population. The adaptation of each group to their respective environments is one of the reasons why, despite sharing a common ancestry, they evolved in such distinct ways. Now that we understand how geography and history have influenced the different trajectories of the Korean, Chinese, and Japanese populations, an important reflection arises. How can these genetic similarities help connect these diverse cultures? The answer lies in a deeper understanding of migrations and interactions throughout history, as well as the genetic discoveries that allow us to trace these invisible links between peoples. Genetics, contrary to what many might think, is not just a straight line connecting individuals. It is also a thread that weaves a rich tapestry of cultural and historical exchanges. Koreans, Chinese, and Japanese, although they followed different evolutionary paths, carry in their DNA the marks of a long history of migrations, influences, and connections. As we saw, More than half of the DNA of these populations has its roots in the ancient Neolithic farmers of the Green Run. And this point of origin is a powerful link that connects these cultures profoundly. These interactions throughout history have shaped not only genetics, but also the cultural identities of each of these peoples. For example, China, with its role as an economic and cultural powerhouse, has been fundamental in the diffusion of new technologies, philosophies, and religions that influenced neighboring societies. Confucianism, for example, originating in China, had a profound impact on Korean society and also influenced aspects of Japanese life. Japan, in turn, throughout its history, has been remarkably adaptable to external influences. Despite its policy of isolation for centuries, the country managed to absorb and adapt cultural practices from China and Korea, especially in areas such as writing, Buddhism, and the arts. However, as discussed earlier, Japan also maintained a strong sense of its own identity, managing to preserve unique elements such as the language and customs that continue to define the nation today. Korea, situated between China and Japan, has historically been a point of cultural and political confluence. The presence of Buddhism, commercial interactions with China, and cultural influences from Japan during different historical periods helped form a resilient and unique Korean culture. The intense national pride and emphasis on the preservation of Korean culture and identity are also part of this evolutionary history. These connections, although based on genetics, are also cultural. Genetics, over thousands of years, gives us a unique perspective to understand the roots of each people, but cultural, social, and historical exchanges are what truly solidify the identity of a nation. In the end, genetics connects, but it is history that defines each culture. What surprised you most about this relationship between Chinese, Koreans, and Japanese? Comment below. Oh, and if you haven't subscribed yet, do so now and hit the bell to not miss the next videos.